All right, we'll just get started here. I want to welcome everyone to our Americanist Dinner Forum for American Culture Studies here at Washington University in St. Louis. And I am very excited today for our topic for the evening, Faith, Hollywood, and Presidential Rhetoric in the 2020 election. And we have with us today three guests that I'm very excited about, and I know that you all are as well. So I'm going to start in alphabetical order and just introduce everyone. First, we have with us Kathryn Brownell. She is the Associate Professor of History at Purdue University, and she teaches courses on U.S. history, 20th century U.S. political history, and the American presidency. And she is the author of the book Showbiz Politics, Hollywood and American Political Life. And she's currently working on a political history of cable television from the Nixon administration through the Clinton years. And she's also an editor for Made by History column, the Made by History column at the Washington Post. We're so excited to have Kathryn here with us today. Next in alphabetical order, we have Wayne Fields, who is the Lynn Cooper Harvey Chair Emeritus in English. He is a noted author and expert on American presidential rhetoric and political argument. He is the author of Union of Words, A History of Presidential Eloquence. And we're so excited to have Wayne here with us today. And finally, in alphabetical order, we have with us Abram Van Engen, who is Associate Professor of English. He's the Director of English Graduate Studies. He's also Associate Professor of Religion and Politics by courtesy, and he is a Director of Graduate Studies for the American Culture Studies program here at Washington University. He is the author of Sympathetic Puritans, Calvinist Fellow Feeling in Early New England, and most recently, he's the author of A City on a Hill, A History of American Exceptionalism. So we are excited that you all are here with us tonight, and we don't want to hesitate. We want to get started and ask a couple questions, and then we'll turn to the audience for Q&A. So I'm going to start with you, Wayne, and you're an expert in American presidential rhetoric. Could you tell us, to start us off, when did presidential rhetoric become so important in our nation's history, and particularly to our politics?
In the Constitution. I mean, the moment in which the president is instructed to report to the Congress from time to time on the State of the Union places a particular kind of challenge before the presidency that I think is definitive in terms of the office. For me, the extraordinary presumption of the United States insisting that it can be simultaneously many and one, and not just as a kind of aside where a whole lot of people and we'll try to get along kind of thing. It's a philosophical, in some ways even a theological commitment that we can do both of these, and we make this central. I mean, it becomes the motto, E pluribus unum. It becomes the first line of the Constitution, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And then we elect hundreds of people to represent our differences, the multitude of Americans, and we elect one office to represent the union itself. And I think that piece of the Constitution that gives the presidency the responsibility for having a conception of the union in mind, reporting on where we are in terms of the development and perfection of that conception, is definitive in terms of that office. And so from that point on, and then Washington took that as the primary obligation of his presidency, to try to build affection among his countrymen who loved him but didn't care much for each other, affection among his countrymen for one another, and to develop a commitment to a national union when in fact they were inclined to think of themselves as citizens of states and not of that union. Had very little conception of what the United States might be. And so the Washington presidency, starting with the inaugural address and continuing through the farewell address, is a constant representation of the importance of union, the possibility of that even in the midst of our divisions and our multiplicity. And he's always calling on the army of the American Revolution as his evidence that this is possible. They came with local prejudices, mutual suspicions, and they became one band of brothers, he says. So that it seems to me that from the very start, the presidency and what the president says is crucial to that whole conception and the longing that we have, in spite of our suspicions and jealousies, for profounder wholeness.
I like that. That's well said. And you mentioned part of that, Wayne, is that theology is a part of that. So I'm going to turn to Abram next. Abram, when did this language of city on a hill and American exceptionalism become so important to presidential rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between the sense of the nation as a theological conception and the sense of the nation as a city on a hill, because in fact, the thing I talk about in my book, the City on a Hill book, is that rhetoric is actually pretty recent. A city on a hill. I'm getting a little bit of. Is it getting difficult? Is my internet going?
We lost you for a second, but now
Yeah.
we can
All
hear
right.
you.
All
We
right.
lost your
So
visual.
I'm going to take my visual off in the hopes that my internet
Okay.
will stick with us for a moment. It's been tricky
Okay.
these past few days. So anyway,
Okay.
and if you hear my children dancing around upstairs, I apologize for that. So anyway, so the city on a hill. So the city on a hill concept. So this is actually pretty recent. I mean, there has been a long time in people thinking about the United States as a nation that has a particular destiny, that is called out by God with a particular role and given a particular destiny by God, and that has been around for a long time. But what is interesting to note is that the moment at which it becomes tied to this language of city on a hill, because the city on a hill language actually is taken from the gospel. It's taken from the Sermon on the Mount. It's taken from Matthew. And so when Jesus uses that language, so in my book, I talk about, we searched for that language all through the 1800s, all through pretty much every printed book included in the Google Books database. And it came up all over the place, of course, but it never came up in reference to the nation. It was always in reference to the church. And so we actually, we were able to create graphs that show at what point this becomes a political phrase. And it doesn't become a political phrase. America does not become called a city on a hill really by any group of people or any president even until the Cold War. And so that just gives you a demonstration of the way that the nation takes over the language of the church and becomes a church unto itself. And so it's part of the history of this phrase is the history of the conceptions of American exceptionalism that go back a long ways, and the changing state of American exceptionalism. So in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, for example, you'll have moral claims about American freedom and liberty, and that God has called us out to be a model to the nations. There's some of that language in there. But it's interesting because it's always a moral claim to advancement and never a sort of a power claim, right? And it couldn't be, because we didn't have the strongest military or the strongest economy in the world. All of that was Britain. Britain dominated the world in terms of military and economy for the entire 19th century. And so there was never any claim to the greatness of America in terms of its military might or its economy or any of that. And then you can see in the Cold War how that gets wrapped into the conception of moral economy and moral greatness. And so there's all these ways in which the language of America changes over time, and the language of American exceptionalism changes over time as well. But thinking through the particulars of the phrase city on a hill shows us how the nation can adopt the language of the church and turn itself into a kind of church that requires a similar sort of devotion of its citizens.
That's well said. Thank you. And so, Kathryn, when in the world did Hollywood enter into all this mess?
So how does Hollywood factor in? It's a really great question. And I think that what I've found in my work is that Hollywood enters as presidents are grappling with new technology, notably the demands of radio and motion pictures, and then later television. And in terms of how they're going to connect this rhetoric, these narratives that Abram and Wayne are talking about, how can the president connect it to a broader base? And Hollywood advertisers, public relations consultants come into the conversation because they are telling presidents that there's a better way to communicate some of these ideas. And so, Wayne is talking a lot about these ideas of the Union, but how the president delivers that message really dramatically changes in the 20th century. In the 19th century and even early 20th century, political parties play a really prominent role in shaping that communication between the president and the people. And with new technology, there emerges new individuals with alternative communication expertise and ways to connect with visuals, ways to connect, thinking through production strategies, thinking through that question of showmanship. And so there's a shift over the 20th century where you have a politics that's really dominated by political parties and insider politics, urban machines in terms of delivering the vote and controlling messaging, to one in which it's dominated by the media. And entertainers and advertisers and consultants are brought in to help craft that message for parties themselves and for individual presidents as well. And this is incredibly controversial. Those people who are in control of messaging don't give that up easily. And they're constantly making this argument that if you turn to an entertainer for advice, it's becoming more about style than substance. And so that idea that you can have one or the other is deeply baked into this controversy in terms of introducing new ways of communication. But eventually, these entertainers convince political leaders that they have something that is valuable, that they have expertise that needs to be heeded when different candidates or different presidential administrations are thinking about how they want to connect to the broader public. And one of the things I think that's really key that connects to some of the issues that are very relevant today is that it's actually during times of technological change and crisis that some established political traditions of communication can really be upended, and that new ways, new modes of communication can be introduced. And so FDR during the Great Depression used radio and motion pictures. He needed to sell a new deal to the American people. He wanted to be in control of the messaging and wanted to really go around Republican editors of newspapers who were very critical of his New Deal. And so he thought that the best way to do that during this moment of crisis is to try something new and to sell it via radio and in theaters. World War II and the Cold War, this idea emerges that motion pictures can be a weapon of war. Yes, it's propaganda, but it's seen as justified because so much of this Cold War is this battle of symbolism, this battle of ideas, and that entertainers have a unique skill to sell democracy. Therefore, they should be, quote unquote, ambassadors of democracy. So I think, again, there are these moments of technological change, but also kind of this idea of crisis that it demands innovation in terms of thinking about how to throw off concerns about propaganda and manipulation and really embrace the power of new mediums.
So in the midst of all that, and that's really, really, really fascinating history, Wayne, is there one person you think in your read that if we were to walk away from this conversation, who's the one pivotal figure you think as it relates to enunciating this kind of, using this platform, I should say, as the bully pulpit? Is there one president you think that really emerges that you would like for us to think about?
Well, there is. You already know who he is, but before I would say you have this moment repeated over and over again. I would say the first dramatic moment, which has to be addressed, is in Jefferson's inaugural. You've had a vicious and a campaign that people thought they could not recover from. One in which you have Republican governors offering militias to make sure that Adams leaves office, whereas in fact Adams left town even before the inauguration. But what he says at that point, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. What he keeps insisting in that speech is we can be one despite partisanship, which up till then, the conventional wisdom, you can't have both. You can't have civic virtue and partisanship. Washington insisted on that. And so Jefferson at that moment is saying, yeah, we can divide up in parties and still be one people, brethren in the same principle and that sort of thing. I'd say FDR in the fireside chats reminding Americans about other Americans and their plight, so that if you're in the city, he tells you about farmers. If you're on the farm, he tells you what's going on in the city. That kind of conscious effort week after week to connect Americans into something larger at a moment in which they can only see their special circumstances and plight. But of course, the grand moment is Lincoln's, because the conventional wisdom up until the Civil War was that the Union, once broken, could never be restored. I mean, you hear this from everybody. It's the one threat that keeps the Union together. Yeah, we know we have these terrible differences. We have all these things going on, but if it ends, we're done. And what Lincoln was asserting in every speech, especially the two inaugurals, is that we are not separable. Secession, as it took place, did not break the Union. And it ultimately becomes a theological argument. That in the second inaugural, how can a just God demand as much from the slave states as from the free states? And the first step is, because we are one, we are all guilty, that there is not a separate judgment, because this is that kind of a union. And then he extends it, if every lash drawn by the slave owner's whip has to be matched by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, there is in all of this a fundamental divine assertion that the Union cannot be broken, that we are one under judgment, and we are one in terms of the possibility of renewal. So I'd say that his was the greatest challenge, and he responded in a most remarkable way.
He did. Abram, as it relates to the city on a hill or American exceptionalism, what figure would you invite us to focus on as a really pivotal figure in the development of this rhetoric? Are you going to go with Lincoln as well?
No, not in terms of City on a Hill. I apologize again that my internet is not working so great and that the video has to be turned off, but hopefully I can hang in there here for the audio. No, this is a bit of a longer story, but there's two key figures in the 20th century. So I want to sort of back into this very slowly, but it's both Perry Miller, the scholar at Harvard, and Ronald Reagan, the president, who popularized the notion of America as a city on a hill. But there's a long backstory to that, and I'll try to keep it short, because I think it's actually really important to where the rhetoric stands now, and why the rhetoric came into existence to begin with. So this language of city on a hill, it all goes back to a framing of the nation as based in New England, as based in the coming of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. When Reagan talks about America as a city on a hill, he talks about that in relation to the coming of John Winthrop, the first Puritan governor of Massachusetts Bay, who presumably in 1630 said that we shall be as a city upon a hill, and that all people's eyes shall be upon us, and so on. The problem with that story of America is that Winthrop's sermon was unknown in its own day. Nobody noted it. Nobody took it down. Nobody said he gave that speech. He didn't publish that speech. He never said he gave that speech. There's basically zero record of that sermon from the 17th century. The earliest record we have of it shows up 200 years later in the 1830s. They find this sermon and they say, this looks like it's from Winthrop. You might care about this over in New England. They find it in New York. And they say in New England, yeah, we care about that. So they publish the sermon. They say, hey, this is the great Winthrop giving a great speech. And then it's totally ignored again for another 100 years. And so what this illustrates is that when we think about these sort of foundational moments, we were established in such and such a way, and therefore we must stay true to that foundation. Often the foundation is itself invented, and it's invented for particular reasons and for particular ends. The coming of the Pilgrims allows you, if that's the origin of America, then the coming of every other people and every other institution that came here can be ignored as not really America. And that you see that very much happening in the first textbooks that get written. So in my book, City on a Hill, I talk about a woman named Emma Willard, who most of us have forgotten. But she was so famous that her obituary appeared in 70 different cities when she died. She sold over 1 million history textbooks in the 1800s. And she founded a whole system of women's education in the United States that was taken abroad to Colombia and Scotland and Prussia as well. So she was extremely famous in the 1800s. And one of the reasons why she was so famous is she reinvented the way history was taught in schools. She introduced maps and charts. She drew a picture of the entire history of the United States in a single tree, so that as you move from branch to branch, you would move from turning point to turning point in American history. And this tree became super important and reprinted all over the place. And of course, the turning points turn on everything that she wants to count as the key points in American history. So, for example, Jamestown is not there. It's not a turning point in American history, even though it came before the Pilgrims and before Plymouth Rock. Jamestown is not in the tree, and therefore slavery is not in the tree. And so by telling a story that we are rooted in the Pilgrims and the Puritans, we can tell a story in which America stands for freedom because they came here for freedom. And everything else that happened to come here, or everybody else who came here, doesn't really define America. So what's interesting about this, I'll try to keep this a little bit short, but what's interesting about this is that, of course, the Pilgrims and the Puritans are not the same people. And the Pilgrims came in 1620, the Puritans in 1630. And so when people like Emma Willard celebrated the Pilgrims, they didn't have any place in their narrative for John Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon because it was 10 years later than the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims had already been here for 10 years by the time he came and gave that speech. And so what really happens with Perry Miller first, who's this really predominant Harvard scholar of the mid 20th century, is that he says, look, the Pilgrims don't matter. You shouldn't start America with them. They were sort of a washed up group of people who were just fleeing things, and they had no point and no purpose. And their colony basically was a small diminished thing that got swallowed up by Massachusetts, all of which is largely true, by the way. And he said that the real story is the story of the coming of the Puritans in 1630. And this sermon, which he discovers in the archives, this sermon is the real foundation of America, this City on a Hill sermon. And so he reinvents the origin of America in the 1950s. JFK is the first person to use it, the first president to use it. JFK went to Harvard. We don't know if he exactly picked it up from Perry Miller, all these connections there. He's the first person to use it, and then Reagan is the one who makes it famous. And Reagan very famously called Winthrop a Pilgrim. He wasn't a Pilgrim, he was a Puritan. And when he gets called on it, and they say, you're calling him a Pilgrim, he wasn't a Pilgrim, he was a Puritan, he came later. Reagan says, yeah, but he traveled around like all pilgrims do, so I just like to call him a pilgrim. But basically, you could see Reagan intentionally blending these two origins into one new origin story of America. The City on a Hill sermon is Plymouth Rock, is the Pilgrim, is the story of freedom. It's all just one grand beginning. And so that becomes the turning point when this becomes the new story of the invented foundations of America.
Well, that's a fascinating story. It's and there's some Hollywood in there, Kathryn. As you know, we've got Reagan, who was, I guess, a B-rate actor. I guess we could debate that later after we're off the air. And Kennedy as well, being the televised debate with Nixon. So, what figure do you really want us to focus on? You think that's really pivotal for in bringing Hollywood into this moment?
I think Kennedy is very pivotal in some capacities. And of course, Reagan is too. When I actually started doing research for this book, it's because I was interested in Reagan and the connection between Hollywood and presidential politics that he really embodied. But then I started digging and found that he is actually a culmination of a bipartisan political tradition that really extended, again, across the political spectrum. That goes back to the 1920s. And so I actually don't deal with Reagan's presidency in my book that is about Hollywood in American political life. And I debated this very intently with my editor, who thought you have to have a chapter on Reagan. And my argument is that, yes, Reagan is influential, but it's Reagan's earlier time. It's his political career in Hollywood, but actually more significantly, his transition from actor to politician that is really, really significant. And I actually think one of the most influential people that I have studied in terms of the rise of this showbiz politics is Richard Nixon. And that may surprise people because, of course, when you think of Richard Nixon, you don't think of someone who is necessarily very media savvy. But Richard Nixon was thoroughly obsessed with his media image, and he studied it intently, more intently than really anyone else that I have seen in terms of presidential administrations. He really owed his political visibility to television, being able to take advantage of it effectively in the 1950s. And of course, in the 1960 election, he really falls flat on television. The TV debates really stand out as his inability to really connect with audiences. And there's a lot of stories, about his image and the sweaty brow and everything that happens in the first debate. But in fact, that's just that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of the broader media strategy that he had for his campaign that year. He wanted to present himself. Again, he was thinking about television. The idea that he wasn't thinking about television just isn't accurate. He was very worried about his image. But he wanted to present himself as this statesman, as someone who's very serious, and strictly counter the criticism that his opponent, John F. Kennedy, had gotten by pursuing more of a media-driven celebrity style. He frequently said that Kennedy is all about style and I'm the one that's about substance. And he really criticized John Kennedy for using what he called, quote, cheap publicity in terms of his interactions with figures like Frank Sinatra and his very glitzy celebrity style that Kennedy did use for a very particular purpose to generate media attention and to create political authority. And so Nixon is tapping into this conversation, this controversy over using entertainment in the 1960 election. But then when he loses very closely in that election, he starts to think about what went wrong. He then, of course, runs for the California governorship 2 years later, and he loses that campaign. And he thinks about what went wrong. And he blames the media. He blames media coverage of him that he thinks is biased, of course. But he also blames his television performance. And so he starts obsessing about how he can better conquer television. So he's convinced that he lost the 1960 election because of television. As a historian, I can tell you there are many reasons that he lost the 1960 election. Is TV a factor? Absolutely, it's a factor, but it's only one of many factors. And in fact, Kennedy's style may have cost him as many votes as it actually helped gain him votes. But nevertheless, in Richard Nixon's mind, it's because of television. So he starts studying those people who are successful on television. And when he's thinking about running for the presidency in 1968, he starts studying and studying those people that he sees as very media savvy. And he starts studying Ronald Reagan. This is one of the biggest surprises that I found when I was at the Richard Nixon Library. I told the archivist what I was interested in, and they had just opened up a lot of new material, which is always very exciting as a historian, about Nixon's re-election campaign in 1972. But they also opened up this new material that was just labeled Reagan research. And there were boxes and boxes of Reagan research that Nixon and his team were combing through everything that Ronald Reagan was doing. They were reading all of the literature talking about Reagan's effectiveness and just studying everything that he was doing. And my favorite find in this collection is a speech that one of his media advisors gives him and says, this is Reagan at his finest, is what he says. And then there's a handwritten note by Richard Nixon on this speech. And he says, quote, "We may think this is demagoguery, but it is very effective. Reagan reaches the heart. We reach the mind. Do we not miss an opportunity in failing to reach the hearts and not just the heads?" And to me, this really encompasses how he's completely revamping his media strategy, following in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan. And he is studying what Kennedy did before him and taking it as his gospel, that this is the path to political power. He hires people like Roger Ailes and a variety of other media advisors to help him take television seriously. And of course, in a very telling way, he takes advantage of cheap publicity, and he goes on the very popular show Laugh-In to say, "Sock it to me," in a very awkward way, to try to connect to some of these audiences through entertainment, and to simply try to make voters like him. He thinks that this is a way to, again, show that he has a personality that and you can try to use that to draw in voters. When that wins in 1968, he firmly believes that the difference between Nixon the loser and Nixon the winner is this showbiz style, is taking television seriously and making that a priority. And that shapes how he governs. It's the dominant factor in his reelection campaign. But then it also starts to contribute to changes in the Republican Party, where someone like Ronald Reagan is taken seriously and seen as having the qualifications needed to succeed in this television age.
Wow. Wow. Sock it to me. Okay. So with all that being said, we've got the idea of a country divided, presidential rhetoric bringing a country together, perhaps driving a country apart. We've got this invented history or invented myth, if you will, about exceptionalism. And we've got Richard Nixon not only saying, "Sock it to me," but Richard Nixon really being a pioneer in bringing Hollywood. So what in the world, and I'll leave this open to the three of you to go at it. What in the world does this tell us about our current moment? In particular, how does it explain the rise of Donald Trump and even the presidential election of 2016 or 2020? And I'll just leave it open if anybody wants to go. Wayne, Abram, or Kathryn, just how did we get here? And can you explain it to us and help us?
Well, yeah, if I could do that, I'd have a better next book than I'm likely to have. First of all, the complication from my perspective is if you have a period in American history in which the president speaks for division rather than union, and which the president has a very low regard of language generally, but rhetoric, I think, particularly. So that the idea that aspect of the office, which has been so crucial historically for us, is sort of dismissed for 4 years means it's a kind of, in some ways, frightening situation. Most presidents have not been terribly articulate, and they've not been terribly effective. Most of them haven't needed to really in any dramatic way make the union real for their fellow countrymen. But they've all, in a sense, pretended to. I mean, we go through these cycles of division and then reconciliation. You have primaries and parties split into factions, and then they choose a candidate, and you go through some presumed reconciliation of the different factions in the support of that candidate. And then you have the competition between parties. And no matter how nasty, at the end of that, usually starting with the inaugural address, there is some kind of assertion that we are one people and that we will move ahead together and that I will try and be an instrument of that. And some of that is a kind of show business. I mean, Reagan was good at that. But what you have now is almost the exact opposite of that in most instances. And how we got there is probably a complicated history in which most of us explain the niche cultures that cable creates, the way in which we do not have to even recognize each other's existence in the culture that we have at the moment. We don't have to talk to each other. We don't have to pretend to civility by and large. And now we've got congressional delegations that used to have to get along to some extent to get what they wanted for the delegations, who find it more important to separate completely from one another. Yeah. So it seems to me that the ends both of the presidency, as I understand it, and of political rhetoric in a democracy are being defied by the very system itself at the moment. I always, whenever I see the president now, I see in the back of my mind the preliminaries to a World Wrestling Federation wrestling match, where these very inflated human beings, steroided up, vaunting at each other, taunting, making outrageous claims, saying things everybody in their audience knows is false, but it's part of the performance, part of the game, part of the fun of it. It's hard to accept that as a kind of presidential mode, but it seems to me that it's not inconsistent with what we've seen elsewhere in the culture.
I think that's a really important point, because of course entertainment has a long tradition and in being involved in presidential politics, and Donald Trump really does build off of some of these changes in party politics and changes in the media. That really allowed him to have credibility from the beginning because of his celebrity, and allowed him to assert his political authority because he could garner ratings and he could shape the media narrative and really control the conversations to have it focus on him. However, I think that there's a really key distinction in terms of the difference that entertainment plays in the Trump administration than it has in previous ones. And that is, previously, entertainment has been a tool to connect to the broader public, a tool to sell a particular agenda, a tool to mobilize voters, maybe even raise money on the campaign trail, a tool to engage. It has not been the end goal. And I think that that's actually one of the changes that we see with the Trump administration is he's constantly worried about the production that he is putting out, not as a way to advance his agenda, but to continue the focus on what he is doing in his ratings. The ways that he constantly talks about ratings is very, very different. I mean, of course, presidents before him were very concerned about their image on television and whether, they were very critical of media coverage of them, but they weren't as focused on this idea of ratings, which again, I think you can see that for him, this is all about creating entertainment. And it's also a very different style of entertainment than I have really studied by looking at Hollywood, and that Hollywood is very much about a polished production. It's about creating an effective narrative, having all of the tools available at the production studio to make it as polished and professional as possible, where he's really coming out of an entertainment tradition that is rooted in reality television. Right. That idea of shock and awe, that you use entertainment to create your personal brand. I actually wrote a piece during the 2016 election that really contrasted the difference between Ronald Reagan, who was part of a production team, who led a union, who, was very much this idea of entertainment is a creation, that all people come together and to do that. And that's part of his work in Hollywood, was that production teamwork, where, Donald Trump is rooted in reality television that is very much about an individual brand and what can you do to draw attention to yourself, which again is more of that shock and awe style of entertainment.
I was curious how you would answer that, Kathryn, because I also in the studies of American exceptionalism and City on the Hill stuff, Trump represents not a culmination, but a complete and utter contrast and change from the stories that have been going on. And so I was wondering for you whether he represented a kind of culmination or a radical change. So that's interesting to hear that alteration, because it's the same kind of thing with the rhetoric of American exceptionalism and City on the Hill. In 2015, I was teaching the class on the history of American exceptionalism, and he was running for president, and he said in an interview that he opposes American exceptionalism because he finds it rude. And that's no way to talk in Germany when you're trying to do a deal and so on. And I thought, that along with what he was saying about immigrants and refugees and so on. And we were studying this rhetoric from Reagan and others who were saying we're a city on a hill because we have been, the place where pilgrims want to get to, the place for refugees and so on. We studied Reagan's farewell address, where he compares John Winthrop to a refugee from the South China Seas. And this is the story of America that Reagan wanted to tell. And so I thought, well, this guy Trump doesn't have a chance. I mean, this rhetoric is the complete opposite of everything that has been, what has gotten people elected for so long. And so in my book, so then of course he got elected. But at that moment, we started tracking the phrase "City on a Hill" using Google Alerts, and we tracked for a year. We tracked the phrase, and so we got 1,100 articles and blogs and letters and things like that out there that use the phrase "city on a hill." So then we went through and tagged what is being called a city on a hill and what is the phrase being used for. And by huge margins, wherever you saw that phrase in the campaign of 2016, it was used against Donald Trump, including by the right.
Wow.
So the people who most were committed to the phrase "City on a Hill," people like Mitt Romney and so on, were the sort of never Trumpers, most opposed to Donald Trump folks. So America First, in many ways, represents a kind of radical change from the language of American exceptionalism. And in the change, what's really weird to watch and witness is the ways in which the left has embraced the language of City on a Hill and American exceptionalism and tried to adjust it to their political point of view, but nonetheless embrace it. So, you know, you have Barack Obama saying, "I embrace American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being." You have Hillary Clinton giving a speech on American exceptionalism to the American Legion during her campaign, explaining why she believes in this principle as well, and why it has always guided her. And you see this sort of embrace of it on the left. What it's not the same form of American exceptionalism as what was on the right, but it's very obvious that it's the way to counter America First. And so now you have Joe Biden fighting for the soul of the nation, which is the front and center on his campaign page and in every speech he gives now. And you have this very interesting rhetoric occurring in which it's not clear where the language of American exceptionalism stands these days or where it's exactly going. It's just clear that the language of America First is not it. And so you have these two alternatives, each with their own sort of moral hazards, American exceptionalism and America First. But they sort of squared off in 2016.
Wow. This is great. I want to ask one more question, and then we'll get to the audience Q&A. So if the folks who are watching, participants want to start thinking about their questions, I want to ask our panelists all to look into the crystal ball that I all know you have. And all of you are engaged in historical work. And of course, this is what a lot of historians hate, the question I'm about to ask, but so I have to ask it. And that is like, what do you see for the future? Presidential rhetoric, American exceptionalism. Abram, you got to that a little bit, but if you could say more. Kathryn, Hollywood, reality TV. What do you all see for the future? Is President Trump, has he set some trends here that people will try to follow or go in the other direction? Wayne, you want to start us off?
Of course. Well, it's impossible to say, except that I think we do see pretty consistently in the presidency more a reaction to rather than a continuation of, even when the same party stays in power, that people get worn out by grandiloquent presidents. They may hunger for a certain level of eloquence and then they get exhausted by it. And so plain speaking becomes the thing. It seems to me we've reached a point of exhaustion that's pretty profound at the moment. And we're likely to enter a time where I think these same tactics and strategies will happen in Congress, they'll happen in deliberative bodies, but in which the presidency itself will try to become for a while a kind of quiet center, a place in which there's a lot of listening supposedly going on, which things are being taken in. I think removing the presidency from the kind of tweeting turmoil of the last 4 years will be to any new president's advantage. Now, if Trump continues, he's going to do the same thing because it's what he knows, and it's in a sense all he knows. But it seems to me that if there is a Biden presidency, the Biden presidency will be relatively quiet because that's what the nation needs at the moment. And if we are to come back together, and I think the hunger to be whole doesn't disappear when you have these vicious periods. It gets sharpened in some ways. And I think that will become an increasingly strong political expression in lots of places, whether we know how to do that, whether we can take on the issues of racial and gender discrimination, whether we can take on the hard stuff that is scaring some people into their little enclaves and into their simplistic responses will be the great test. But I think we will have to create the time and space to do that deliberately. And I think that will have to begin with an image of the presidency. That's what I hope happens. But I also think we have some historical evidence that that's very likely to happen. That we've done this now.
Okay.
And the ratings may still be relatively high in some quarters, but it's getting tiresome.
So I think that Wayne is really right to kind of point out those trends that continue to develop, that you have presidential administrations, especially ones that are controversial, that are followed by a president who is reacting to and trying to present a very different leadership style, different communication style. But I also think that even though the style and the language may be different, that in terms of some of these media innovations and the turn towards entertainment to control messaging, to engage voters, that will continue. And what the great example that I'll bring up is, of course, Richard Nixon leaves office. And so much of what Gerald Ford is trying to do in the aftermath of that is to show, that he is honest, that he is not going to lie the way that Richard Nixon did, and he's going to try to heal the nation. And one of the criticisms of Richard Nixon by many journalists and reporters is, again, his control of information, that he was controlling his image so very much and going to all sorts of legal and illegal measures to do that. And so Gerald Ford emphasizes that, he's not going to be Nixonian in how he tries to control his media image, that he's going to be more open and transparent and honest with reporters. But what does he do? He tries to learn from Richard Nixon to manage his image in a way that is not as suspicious, but is equally dedicated to news management and to controlling how people are seeing him and trying to create this presidential leadership communication strategy. So again, it's a different strategy that responds very much to the negative connotations that emerged with image control and Richard Nixon, but it's still intensified. And Jimmy Carter, there's a great new book out by Amber Rosner that talks about Jimmy Carter, right? He is all about transparency and honesty. And, I will not lie to the American people. He was the most media savvy in terms of manipulating press coverage of his candidacy and then ultimately his presidency. And he really, forged ahead with some innovations in terms of entertainment and control of media and those type of innovations in communication. So I think that, as much as I hate looking forward, and if I could anticipate one thing, it would not be this, if I knew what was coming. But I think that entertainment and this idea of how can you control messaging, how can you use, new digital platforms to engage and connect to a variety of different demographics, frequently at the same time in different capacities. I think that will continue to be a pressing priority for presidential administrations moving forward. And I would just end by saying, I just saw the news that there's going to be a West Wing reunion surrounding the Biden campaign. I think it's another one of their strategies, following up of the Hamilton cast coming together to get support for the Biden campaign. And, Biden, of course, has had a lot of Hollywood support, but there's kind of this shift of, integrating the Biden campaign into a reunion of the West Wing, where you have that melding of entertainment and politics, where entertainment kind of takes over that political reality and vice versa. That's happening even on the other side of the political spectrum. And I suspect that will continue to intensify moving forward.
Wow.
Yeah, I would just say, it's hard to know what's going to happen. But one way to understand the difference between American exceptionalism and America First: American exceptionalism requires histories of the nation, and America First does not. And so in 2016, one of the things that was remarkable to me as I was watching the election unfold is that Trump never talked about the history of the nation at all. I mean, I don't think he knows any bit about the history of the nation, but he never even none of his speechwriters himself, nobody tried to offer any kind of historical narratives of the nation, and therefore we stand for X because of this long history. Instead, his conception of the nation was very much like a corporation. Like each nation is a sovereign corporation. We're all engaged in this sort of struggle with each other. There's winners and there's losers. Let's be the winners. And there's no history to that. There's no sense of a sort of unique destiny that comes out of a unique history or anything like that. What I find interesting is that even now, the forces of kind of American exceptionalism are strong enough that Trump has begun to tell histories of the nation. So in the RNC thing, the latest thing in August, his speech, it ended with a very long and very 1950s style history of the nation. And so what was remarkable to me is that the America First style of this history of turning to histories of the nation that set us apart goes back to the 1950s accounts of the history of the nation. So they're even sort of whiter than the 1980s versions of American exceptionalism. So his account of the history of nations that we were built by pilgrims and pioneers who came here for freedom and settled the open range. And this is what he keeps talking about in his speech there. And so there's no conception of any other race in America. There's no conception of Native Americans in America. There's no conception of other peoples in America. It's just pilgrims and pioneers building churches in the open range. It's literally what he says. So what I find interesting is that there will always be a struggle to capture the history of the nation for a broad popular audience. And a lot actually rides on that. And I think that the model that Obama offered is probably the model that's going to come forward in the Biden presidency, if there is a Biden presidency, which would be the sense of an ideal established at the founding that we've never yet reached. And so more perfect union was always the key phrase for Obama. That is to say, we're not there yet, was the way of thinking about American exceptionalism. It's established ideals that we've never yet reached. And so it's both a kind of turning back to the foundations, but it's also a looking forward to the future and the progress we still have to make. And that was the form of American exceptionalism you kind of got out of Obama, and that I presume you will get out of Biden.
This is great. This is great. We've got two questions we'll go to the audience. One is a quick one, and it's in one sentence, given what you all know and have stated tonight, what advice would you give if you were a consultant to a presidential candidate, knowing what you know? In one sentence. Apparently, you have a very short time with the candidate. Knowing what you know, what advice would you offer?
Listen.
Okay, I like that. All right.
I mean, it's a solid question. It depends upon what you want your goal to be. Do you want your goal to be a better nation or to be elected? You know, it's interesting. In 2016, when I was teaching that class, I thought I had the advice that could get anyone elected, because I had studied so many elections and the rhetoric of American exceptionalism, the way that it threaded through that. And I thought, if you want to get elected, these are the kinds of things you say about America, X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And then Trump was elected. So I thought, well, I don't know what gets elected. So I have no advice to give in terms of how to get elected. Okay. But listen is a good advice for turning us into a better nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Historians are not good at offering advice in one sentence, but I would really hammer home the point that entertainment is a tool, but it shouldn't be the goal. And I think that, again, kind of going throughout the history of the presidency, entertainment has provided opportunities for civic engagement, to connect to new voters, and there's a distinct opportunity there. But I think that we kind of see the dangers of having that be the end focus in terms of a presidential administration, and kind of the ineffectiveness that can arise from that, and the focus on just ratings is not an effective way to govern.
I'd like to add something.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead,
I think
Wayne.
that's in here. When I was thinking a lot about inaugural addresses, there was a pattern that I found that first struck me as odd and then made perfect sense. And that is an anxiety about whether we're living up to a model of patriotism or sacrifice or what civic virtue, I guess would be the closest. For years after the Washington presidency, every president inaugural address insisted we live up to the example of Washington. We live up to the sacrifices of the armies of the revolution. And the farther we got from that, as more of that generation died off, the greater the anxiety that we didn't measure up. And then we had the Civil War. And for the next 40 years, you get over and over again, are we living up to that sacrifice? Are we living up to that model? In the 20th century, you get this as just as repeatedly. George W., the first George Bush, goes to the, and then has this funny interruption. It's the revolution, it's the Civil War, it's World War II. And then he says, somehow, don't let this nation be divided by a memory. And the war he goes to is Vietnam. We got to erase Vietnam. We got to think, how do we get back to World War II? And this, we start talking about the greatest generation. Yeah. And Clinton tries to deal with it by saying that the equivalent, the moral equivalent of all that is the great civil rights movement. Yeah. So that there is, from that time on, how have we proven ourselves? How are we measuring up? And I think that anxiety plays a deeper role in some aspects of our cultural and political life than we recognize. And I think we're going through a period which may explain some of the excesses and craziness of the last several years. It's not just been the 4 years of Trump, that in some sense we know we don't. You know, McCain, when he ran for president, said, give us one more mission. We proved we can do it. Give it back to us. And essentially was saying, you guys don't know what you're doing. You can't live up to that moment. And I think there's a certain amount of doubt culturally that we can.
That's good. We have another question. It's directed to Abram specifically, but if Wayne and Kathryn, if you want to respond, you can as well after Abram. The question comes from Julian McCall, Abram, and the question is, do you see evidence of American exceptionalism on, quote, the far left, parentheses, Bernie Sanders, AOC, etc.?
Not as much. No, I mean, so we did this study. We did I worked with some psychologists at WashU, and we did a survey of 2,000 people on American their beliefs about American exceptionalism, American history, and so forth. And the pool of candidates skewed left. There were more Clinton voters than Trump voters in the pools, by about 60 to 40, but still over 85% of the respondents said they believe in American exceptionalism. So it shows you it is a bipartisan belief. I'll just say the one thing, and no particular demographic, no particular markers could indicate that a certain kind of person would believe in American exceptionalism or not. We couldn't kind of locate it. The only thing that we could pinpoint and say, if this is the story of America that they start with, they do not believe in American exceptionalism, was two words: genocide and slavery. So if America begins with genocide, it is not American exceptionalist. If America begins and is defined by slavery, it is not. They did not believe in American exceptionalism. So words like hate, slavery, genocide, and of course the number of this is a random sample of 2,000 people from the public. The amount of people who started America with those stories was quite small. But wherever we found that America started in that story for them, they categorically did not believe in American exceptionalism. So I don't know how that answers necessarily about Bernie or AOC or the far left, but I have a tendency to believe that no, they categorically reject American exceptionalism as a possibility.
We have a couple more questions, but Wayne or Kathryn, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think that I think there is one strand that's implicit in American exceptionalism, in anything you might call American exceptionalism in the early presidency, it's that we are going to be judged by a higher standard. It's not one of privilege and a special achievement. It's that miraculously we win the revolution. God has to have played a part in this. There's been all this divine encouragement, and if we fail to uphold whatever that presidency believes are the standards we're going to be held to, it's not going to go unnoticed. That I think an exceptionalism in terms of responsibility, not terms of privilege.
The next question is addressed to the whole panel. It's from Sylvia Sukup, and the question is: the Trump presidency has yielded a proliferation, maybe unprecedented proliferation, of insider memoirs. Is this a new phenomenon in terms of sheer quantity, and does it also have an entertainment dimension?
Yes, that's a great question, Sylvia. And I would say that you also see a lot of memoirs that come out during the Nixon administration. And I think that's really where you see this, the idea of publishing memoirs about your account, and that really starts to take off. Obviously, that's not something new under the Nixon, but it's something that does expand dramatically in the aftermath of the Nixon administration. And I think there are two reasons. The first is that many people who are writing their memoirs are trying to distance themselves from Watergate. They're trying, my bookshelf is filled with them. They are, a lot of people who are trying to say, look, like, I wasn't involved in this, like, this is what I did, and really focus a lot on his first term and some of the other things that he's doing. And then they kind of end with Watergate, but they're trying to save their reputations and trying to, say, this is, how I was challenging him, or I was wary about some of these certain things that were developing, or I resigned. But you see a lot of memoirs that come out of the Nixon administration. I think it's really this effort by individuals who were involved in some of the Watergate crimes, and those who were not necessarily in that inner circle, that they're just trying to salvage their reputation. But you see that the number of memoirs really intensifies by the end of the 20th century that come out of people who are working within presidential administrations. And I would argue, and this is kind of linked to some of the work in my new book on cable television, is that many of them are trying to situate themselves for a new career. Someone like George Stephanopoulos, right, who is an advisor to Clinton, is trying to kind of move forward in a career in media. And so these accounts of their time working in an administration become in many ways their resume for launching a new business, whether it's a consulting business or trying out as a commentator on a political or on a cable news program. And so I think that those are the two dynamics that are very much at play in terms of the memoirs that we see coming out. People who are trying to distance themselves from some of the activities that are happening within the Trump administration, and ones that are also trying to create a media persona for themselves on a variety of these talk shows.
Absolutely. The next question is from William White, and William asked, are all three of you have talked about presidents who have led and made choices in a future dominated by perhaps AI, artificial intelligence, and China? Will US presidential leadership simply come off as reactions to a world that they simply cannot control? That's an easy one. Shall I read the question again? William White, William, you have us stuck, dear brother. All three of you have talked about
That's a rich question.
So I know all three of you have talked about presidents who have led, made choices in a future dominated by artificial intelligence and China. Will US presidential leadership simply come off as reactions to a world they simply cannot control?
So I would venture to, again, this is anticipating the future, which is not my strength, but I will draw on the past to do that. And I would say that, I've seen especially debates about television and new technology, debates about, computers and the information age, that those have been very prevalent for several decades now, even longer. And there's always concern about the presidency and what that will look like in these eras of technological change, and this concern that the technology is going to take over, right? This fear of the technology. And I think in many ways, it's not that the technology takes over, but rather you have new voices, new experts that come in to advise the president on how to navigate this new technology. So I think that the answer to that would be that the president might not necessarily be simply reacting, but I think that the president will continue to draw on a new set of advisors with different types of expertise to help him or her navigate this environment.
I also think that whatever happens, presidents will have a tendency to shape the rhetoric such that it makes it look like they're in control. So if it's perceived to us as mere reaction to each given change, it might be still being framed, at least in their own minds, as them in control of the narrative. For example, I think of how does Trump talk to himself about, well, that's not something I want to know, but anyway, about all the about all of his reactions to, I think what in his own mind, he has framed the story such that he is in control and is explaining to us the way that media is after him and persecuting him and on a witch hunt for him, when in fact what it looks like to us is that he's constantly I guess I'll say to me is that he's constantly reacting to each new story of bad information that comes out. And so whether it's reaction or whether it's framed as in control is also a matter of perception.
We had over 100 years of presidents who had very little control of anything in the world that they were a part of. And it seems to me that the presidential responsibility to keep trying to figure out who we are, what our role is, whatever the circumstances are, doesn't really change. That the conditions in which that has to be done change, but they're always changing. The whole question, the presumption of American power, American control of the narrative wasn't always there. And it doesn't seem to me a necessary condition for moving forward. But it will require a continuing re-examination of who we are and what it means to be that in this kind of a world. Rather than the presumption we'll control the world, then that's who we are. I think that has to in any is the consequence of any changes that we see now.
So speaking of technology, our very own Karen Skinner, who is our beloved undergraduate academic coordinator, has a question. Would you all speak to presidential rhetoric in terms of social media? How do you have a city on a hill in a tweet?
Abram's tweeting you now.
Exactly. Abram's saying, Karen, I could have answered this over the water cooler.
I mean, a lot less tweeting would do the world a lot less good. I mean, a lot more good. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, I'm actually interested in whether a new form of American exceptionalism will take over in light of what has become of the nation right now. Because I don't think American exceptionalism is suddenly gone. America First itself is not a sudden new thing. It's been around for a long time. There was America First Party during World War II, led by Lindbergh. And so it's a kind of isolationist strand in American politics and American political rhetoric. It's not new necessarily to Trump, but given the sort of wreckage, the sort of very public wreckage of the last 4 years, it's hard for, I think, anyone to seriously talk about a city on a hill. And so I do wonder whether, like, soul of the nation stuff that Joe Biden is talking about could be a new form of American exceptionalism that tries to take over for what just doesn't even, it's just unconvincing now to talk about us as a city on a hill. And it's going to be much more this sense of a push towards ideals that we haven't yet reached, or recovering ideals that we lost. And I think City on a Hill gets set aside personally. This is, again, predicting the future, which, again, not good at. But I do think that language is probably on its way out for a while. It served a purpose during the Cold War, and it served particularly well as a Cold War rhetoric, and it doesn't serve particularly well now. So tweet or no tweet, I don't think that this phrase "City on a Hill" is going to have a very long political afterlife, in my opinion. Who knows?
So I think adding to that and thinking about presidential rhetoric more broadly, and how do you think about it in this age of social media, and how do you think about it via something like Twitter? I think it's important to remember that you can't accomplish it all in one tweet, and that the broader media environment matters, right? So I think the challenge for presidents in terms of coming up with effective presidential leadership through rhetoric is thinking about how what one says via social media, how that connects with images that people may be seeing on Instagram, and how that connects with maybe a longer message on Facebook, how that connects with a TV image and a TV interview. So thinking about the media environment is very multifaceted. And I think the challenge is, how can something that comes out in a tweet tap into that broader media and more diverse landscape?
We've got two questions that came in back to back, about 4 minutes apart, and they really go together. So I'm gonna put them both together. The first one from William Paul came in and said, "What, in your opinion, constitutes the proper balance of entertainment media and presidential rhetoric? What example or examples come to mind of presidents or political leaders in general who have effectively demonstrated this balance?" David followed up with a question that was similar. One of the criticisms, he says, that was leveled at the Clinton campaign in 2016 was an over-reliance on Hollywood figures and pop culture elites in lieu of campaigning in middle America. So my question is this: is Hollywood or are Hollywood figures still effective in campaigns, or are they a hindrance now? So those kind of questions go together. If you have any examples of folks you think who did it well in the past, or is it perhaps a hindrance today?
That's a great question. Both are. And I think that, again, apparently my line that I'm going to go back to is thinking about entertainment and celebrities as a tool in terms of the political process. And so I think we need to understand what celebrities can add to the conversation, what entertainment events, what, having Bon Jovi play at your rally, what that can do. Right. And recognizing the ways in which entertainment can raise money, the way it can engage certain voters to get them involved in the process, to get them aware of certain messages, maybe talking about a candidate, talking about an issue. I think all of those are they can go out and they can register people to vote, because I think there's this great advertisement from the 1944 election, maybe it's 1940 election, where they talk about a celebrity is registering people to vote, and people were flocking to that opportunity to meet the celebrity and then also engage in the civic process. And so I think it's a recognition of what entertainment can do as a tool. And in the Hillary Clinton's campaign, I think one of the challenges is that it relied on such a professional production, and it was a good production. It brought in all of the strengths of Hollywood and entertainment in terms of how it delivered a show. But in many ways, celebrities and musicians were used to add an energy and enthusiasm to the campaign that Clinton was struggling to do herself. And so I don't think that when entertainment tries to replace the candidate and it can outshine the candidate, that can be very challenging. And then it can be I wouldn't necessarily say it more of a hindrance, but rather more of a distraction, because it doesn't allow the candidate's message to be foregrounded. You know, it's interesting that one of the most dynamic celebrity campaigns of the 20th century was George McGovern's campaign. That he had so many people. Warren Beatty was out there as one of his top advisors, and his concerts were studded with stars, and it was really effective for him in some capacities. It helped him gain attention on the primary trail, and it really helped him establish himself as a serious contender for the nomination. It helped him raise money that he needed to, but it couldn't ultimately deliver the presidency for him. So again, it can be a tool, but I think making that your only strategy and not thinking about the other things that really need to go into campaigns in terms of, you know, building the campaign machinery, turning out the vote, all of that network and that party building, that still has to be a factor.
I'm also curious, and maybe Kathryn, you can speak to this too. You know, having lived almost all my life in the Midwest, I feel like, there's a deep the deep divide between loving and idolizing celebrities, but then dividing that from politics. Like there's a deep skepticism about their politics. So it doesn't necessarily help that some celebrity from California is in your camp. That actually might hurt you in the Midwest, because it's just part of that coastal lefty politics stuff, and that itself has a deep history, right? With the sort of anti-Semitism and the Red Scare and stuff going way back, where you love Hollywood for its productions, but you don't trust Hollywood in politics when it comes to politics. So I'm curious whether Hollywood ever backfires on people, and how that differs from when you become your own Hollywood, like with Trump, basically.
Absolutely. Yes, it backfires. I mean, it's constantly backfired. You know, even Frank Sinatra coming out to support John F. Kennedy was incredibly controversial. And so, and he actually like took out an advertisement in a newspaper to kind of defend his record in Hollywood because it was being used to attack John F. Kennedy. So again, there are a lot of instances where this celebrity mobilization can absolutely backfire. It becomes a way in which another campaign and an opponent can critique a candidate and use kind of some of these high profile people who are endorsing that candidate as fodder for that criticism. So you know, that really, again, that history, that contestation over whether Hollywood entertainers belong in the political process, that is firmly rooted in the history, the longer history of their of celebrities' political mobilization. And so again, yes, they have a spotlight. They can generate media attention. They can really shine a light on certain issues and certain candidates, but then that also comes at a cost. And so I think, you know, campaigns really need to weigh the benefit of particular types of celebrities in different circumstances. Richard Nixon was actually really good at this, is he would study, you know, who he wanted to, you know, he really wanted a country Western star here when he was traveling to the South. He wanted an athlete here. Like, so he was really calculating in terms of what's the demographic appeal that who am I trying to appeal to, and what specific type of celebrity might I bring in to try to help make that appeal.
Yeah. And I thank you for asking that, Abram, because, you know, being from Ohio, there was lots of critique about where Hillary Clinton spent her time and missing the Midwest. And so that's a good point. That leads us to our next question. We've got two more questions, and then we'll call it an evening. We've got about 12 minutes, so we'll try to do this really quickly. The question is from Mark, I think it's Blank, maybe, Mark Blanc, and it is directed at Dr. Brownell, but I think, again, any of you can respond. The question is there any political or cultural benefit of having a president who actively spurns Hollywood industry and the Hollywood PR machine? Mark says, I'm remembering Bernie Sanders' testy interview with the New York Times in which he told reporters that he would not seek to build relationships with Hollywood and celebrities. So the question is it even possible for a president to decouple themselves from the entertainment market at this point?
Well, I very briefly, and then I'd love to hear Wayne and Abram's thoughts on this too. Very briefly, I would just say that, it's become it's actually become a conservative talking point about, the fact that Hollywood is liberal, and this shows that the Democratic Party cannot connect with their voters, and so that idea of elitism and using like that idea, spurning Hollywood as a political attack is something that's really resonated by conservatives. Of course, they were very, I think Ted Cruz was tweeting about, the various celebrity hosts for the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah.
But of course, they forget that they're overlooking the fact that, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump are very much celebrities. And so I think that, yes, it can be a political strategy to criticize, this idea of the cultural elite on the West Coast, and, to criticize Hollywood, and to criticize the mainstream media. But there still has to be a way, if you're going to eschew any relationships with journalists, there still has to be a way that you can navigate that media environment to get your message out there. And I think Donald Trump really shows that he, was very quick to, of course, try to cut off relationships with certain reporters. And he was very quick to say that he doesn't want Hollywood. Part of it's because, Hollywood didn't want to campaign for him. But I think, then he found his own way of creating his own celebrity. So a way that he could build up his own following to get his message out there. And cultivate new networks and new relationships like with Fox News in order to, again, think he had the key is how do you connect your message to the broader people? What are the tools? Who are the individuals? What are the institutions, whether it's journalism or the entertainment industry, that are going to help you do that?
Wayne or
Well, the ethical argument, which almost always is where this comes to bear, the characterization of the speaker, how the audience is perceiving them, how the speaker seems to perceive himself, has always had a theatrical dimension. I mean, that we learn where we can learn. The representation that George Washington saw on stage affected the way he talked to his officers when he'd take off his glasses and put them on, those kinds of things. So that the question, though, is what's genuine for most, in the simplicity of the way most people talk about their evaluation of a speaker, what's genuine? And it's, preaching has been conflicted over this, entertainment, acting modes have been conflicted over, and so certainly politics is going to be. And I think when somebody's too Hollywood, you mean they're too insincere and they're too slick. They're not us, and if they're not us, how can they be anything? There is, I think, a whole question of how the total package is handled, and typically where you get into trouble is the inconsistency between the way one wants to argue in the logical part of, and the way one presents themselves. If they present themselves as impassioned and sort of logic then goes to the wind, that's a different kind of problem. If they present as deliberate, the way Dukakis tried to, and don't seem passionate enough, then it becomes a problem. How can you not care if those awful things happen to your wife? That kind of stuff. So that it's how the total picture is handled and the representation of the speaker, not just in terms of, well, this guy likes me and I've got this endorsement, but in terms of whose argument are you going to trust when we finally get down to an argument? Whose judgment is going to come to bear? And then who here understands who you are and can speak to you in terms that are relevant to your life? So eventually the ethical, the pathetic, the logical all have to come together. And looking for any one piece of these to save you is just going to get you in trouble.
Well said.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, sorry, at this point, I think my kids are racing down the hallway. But anyway, so, in the first book I wrote, I was talking about sincerity. I talked a lot about sincerity because sincerity is a weird thing because it's a thing that is judged by externals. There's no way to actually, you have to view a person, listen to a person, see a person, and then judge a person as sincere, which means that if they want to be sincere and come across as sincere, they have to convey it to you in some kind of way. And that's a really odd conundrum. And so you have this interesting phenomenon of these preaching manuals where they tell the Puritans hated the theaters, for a variety of reasons, and they shut them down. But they also said to ministers to study the actors for how they convey sincerity, because that's what you ought to do yourself. But it should really be sincere. And so it's just an interesting conundrum in terms of performance and so forth. And I do think that there is a reason why someone like Reagan, I know it's not exactly who Kathryn studied, but why an actor can turn into a politician quite naturally. Yeah. Because so much depends upon your ability the voters' ability. Most voters are not like, for example, me, and they don't read politics every day, and they have a very limited sort of engagement with the political message that comes across. And so they see someone, a political figure now and then, and they make snap judgments. And if you're a Reagan type figure, I mean, if you ever look at those Reagan speeches from the 80s, you just, oh, what a warm and compassionate seeming person, right? I mean, it's just, he can convey a certain sincerity quite well. And I think there's a reason for that. And so I do think there is this strong relationship between acting and politics that is not necessarily related to sincerity. In other words, you could be a very sincere politician, but still need to learn how to act.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is wonderful. We've got one last question. We got 4 minutes, everybody. So I'm gonna try to get it in. This is from Cynthia, who was a WashU professional MBA graduate. So shout out to Cynthia. And the question she has is, do you have research to support the perceived evolution of journalism and the news media towards fabricated messages and filtered messaging? For past presidents, news channels were seemingly objective, and the broadcaster, journalist, news/host opinions were not as evident. So the question again is there any research that you all come across to support the perceived evolution of journalism and the news media towards fabricated messages and filtered messages, perhaps even editorializing or fake news? We've got 3 minutes. Go.
I will try to keep my answers short, but it's hard because this is a question at the core of my new book. So I'm happy to talk with you about this in more depth. But again, not to bring everything back to Nixon, but there's a shift with Nixon. Because I think it starts with LBJ, but really intensifies under Nixon. And I would even point to the publication of Joe McGinnis's The Selling of the President, where it becomes, this is a best-selling expose about his political advertising strategy, his effort to manipulate the message of his campaign. And this makes it very clear to all Americans, but especially to journalists, how actively politicians and how actively Richard Nixon is trying to control the information and to present information that's just favorable to him that isn't necessarily the whole picture. And it makes it very clear to them. And I think that really begins their effort to try to pierce through this idea of presidential lies and manipulation and to find out what's true, to find out what's authentic, to kind of go back to what we were just saying. Of course, the Vietnam War, coverage of the Vietnam War, the reality that played out for journalists versus what they heard Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon say, that showed them that they couldn't necessarily always trust what presidents were saying. And so they started to make it their mission to find out what was actually happening behind closed doors. And so I think that there's this really dramatic shift in journalism that happens in the 1960s and then really intensifies under the Nixon administration.
Wayne or Abram?
I'll just say real briefly that I think this is a very different sort of answer to the question, but I just think it's one of the reasons why it's incumbent on humanities professors to talk to their students about sources and authority. And that if we teach nothing else, it's about how to trust sources and how to question sources, and where you get your information from makes a big difference, and why and how. There was just a piece recently, I can't remember where, New York Times or Wall Street Journal, I can't remember where it was a whole story about how the Trump campaign had tried to sell the Hunter Biden story to the Wall Street Journal, because if it came out in the Wall Street Journal, it would have a certain cachet, it would have a certain authority to it. and the
Wow.
Wall Street Journal didn't take it. And it came out, it leaked out in the New York Post and these other places, and it never took on the way it would have taken on if it had come out in the Wall Street Journal, which
Wow.
has a certain authority to it. And it's a whole story about how it almost came out in the Wall Street Journal before the Wall Street Journal turned it down, and it came out in these other places. So I do think these sources do still have a kind of authority to them, and a certain trustworthiness to them. And that needs to be defended. But also it just reminds me of how it's important it is to teach where you get your stories from, where you get your information from. And that's what the humanities do. One of the things that we do.
That's a great answer. Wayne, take us home.
Well, I worked with journalists for a long time, political journalists, and the one thing I learned is it takes a lot of them to do the work we want them to do. And right now there are too few to get the kind of information we want, and too few outlets that will give them the time and the support they need. And we're still living with a tradition that began in the 1980s, probably, with the decline of newspapers and the dependence of most newspapers on the same reporters. So that, this is the key in all kinds of ways for holding a democracy responsible. But it takes human power. There has to be people out there doing it. And right now, there aren't enough.
This was great. This is great. It was a great, great closing. And I'm also reminded, Wayne, to your point that, that newspapers and other outlets, especially local newspapers, are either being shut down or being bought up by major corporations so that the messages are being recycled, right? And sort of circulating. And they seem even more real to the point of authority, as Abram was talking about. And the selling of the president, I need to go back and revisit that, Kathryn. I appreciate you raising that question. This was a great panel. I want to thank you all for your time and your efforts in lending your expertise. In an alternate universe somewhere, we would all go out and get a drink and we would further debate these ideas and further debate everything, but we're not there. I see your dog has joined us, Wayne. What a great way to close us out. It's telling us time to go, time to get off the computer.
She wants her walk.
That's right. Thank you all for joining us, both to our panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you for putting this together,
us.
Lerone.
Yeah. Have a good afternoon, and I hope that you all have your plans set for the election on Tuesday. And Godspeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.